The first time I saw Julian Reeves again after 7 years, he was standing at a podium in our town library, looking nothing like the boy I once knew but somehow exactly the same. "Religion," he was saying to the rapt audience, his voice carrying that distinctive cadence I'd recognize anywhere, "offers beautiful answers to profound questions. The problem is, they're the wrong answers." A ripple of uncertain laughter moved through the crowd, some nervous, some appreciative. This was St. Mary's, after all, a predominantly Catholic town in Massachusetts where faith was as much a part of the landscape as the white church steeples that punctuated the skyline. Not the most receptive venue for an atheist author promoting his latest book. I shouldn't have been there. Bishop Callahan had explicitly advised against it when he'd called to warn me that Julian was scheduled for a speaking tour that included our town. "No need to stir up old associations, Father Bennett," he'd said, concern evident in his voice. "Some fires are best left to die out on their own." But I had come anyway, slipping into the back road just as the introduction ended, collar hidden beneath a scarf despite the mild October evening. I told myself it was professional interest, know thy enemy, and all that. The truth was both simpler and infinitely more complicated. Julian looked good. The awkward intensity of his youth had matured into something magnetic, controlled. His dark hair was shorter than he'd worn it in seminary, now threaded with the faintest hints of silver at the temples, though he couldn't be more than 34. He filled out his lean frame, and the scholarly slouch had been replaced by a confident posture, a far cry from the passionate theology student who had once pressed me against the stacks in the seminary library, whispering quotations from Song of Solomon against my neck. "Faith provides comfort," Julian continued, pulling me from dangerous memories. "I don't dispute that, but comfort isn't the same as truth. Truth requires evidence, reason, and the willingness to change our minds when facts contradict our cherished beliefs." My fingers twitched toward the simple wooden rosary in my pocket, a nervous habit I'd developed over years in the priesthood. Julian had always been brilliant at constructing arguments, even back when those arguments had been in defense of faith rather than against it. His mind was a precision instrument dissecting ideas with surgical accuracy. That mind had been one of the things I'd loved most about him, one of the many things I'd given up in choosing my vocation. "I'm not here to attack anyone's personal belief," he said, his gaze sweeping across the audience. "I'm here because I believe in the power of honest conversation, because I've been where many of you are, devoted, certain, finding meaning in ritual and scripture." For a moment his eyes seemed to catch on mine in the back row, and my heart seized in my chest. But his gaze moved on without recognition, and I released the breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "My journey from devout believer to atheist wasn't quick or easy," he continued. "It was painful, frightening, and profoundly lonely. But it was also liberating in ways I never imagined possible. That's what I've documented in Losing Faith, Finding Clarity, and why I'm so grateful for your willingness to engage with ideas that might challenge your worldview." The rest of his talk passed in a blur, his words washing over me, while my mind replayed fragments of our shared past, study sessions that turned to theological debates that turned to something else entirely. His fingers tracing the lines of a psalm across my palm. His voice raw with emotion. "The last time we spoke, you're making a mistake, Thomas. You're choosing an institution over your own truth." When the QA portion began, I slipped out a side door, unable to risk being recognized, or worse, finding the courage to approach him. Outside, the October air was crisp with the promise of winter, clearing my head of the library's warmth and the disorienting effect of Julian's presence. I walked the 6 blocks to St. Mary's Rectory, my footsteps echoing on the brick sidewalks of our historic downtown. The church loomed ahead, its white steeple illuminated against the darkening sky, a beacon guiding me home, or at least to the place that had been my home since being assigned here after ordination. My phone rang just as I reached the rectory steps. "Bishop Callahan." I considered letting it go to voicemail, but thought better of it. "Good evening, Bishop," I answered, keeping my tone neutral. "Thomas." His use of my first name rather than Father Bennett signaled personal rather than ecclesiastical business. Did you attend the Reeves lecture? I hesitated only briefly. Yes, Bishop, I did. A sigh traveled through the connection. I thought you might. How was it? Professional. Well argued. Respectful considering the subject matter. I paused. He's very good at what he does. He always was. There was a knowing quality to the bishop's voice that made me wonder not for the first time how much he knew about what had transpired between Julian and me during seminary. That's why I'm calling, actually. The Interfaith Council has invited him to participate in a dialogue series while he's researching in the area. They've asked for our participation. My hand tightened around the phone. I'm sure Father Michaels would be an excellent representative. His background in apologetic. They've specifically requested you, Thomas, the bishop interrupted gently. Apparently, Mr. Reeves mentioned your name as someone he'd be willing to engage with. The ground seemed to shift beneath my feet. Julian had asked for me. After 7 years of silence, he was requesting a direct engagement. It would be a series of 3 public conversations, the bishop continued when I didn't respond. Faith and reason. Morality without religion. Finding meaning in a material universe. All very civilized, very academic. And you want me to do this? I finally managed. I want you to consider it carefully, he replied, his voice softening. This could be valuable for our community, having these difficult conversations in a respectful forum. But I also know there's history there. History. Such a bland word for what had existed between Julian and me, the fierce connection that had nearly derailed my vocation before it began. You don't have to decide immediately, the bishop added. Pray on it. But they're hoping to begin next week while he's still in residence at the university. After we disconnected, I let myself into the quiet rectory, moving through the darkened rooms to my study. I should pray about this decision, as the bishop suggested. Instead, I found myself opening my laptop and typing Julian Reeves author into the search bar. Dozens of results appeared instantly. His book, Losing Faith, Finding Clarity, had been published 8 months ago to significant acclaim. He'd been featured on national talk shows, podcasts, academic panels. There were videos of his lectures, articles he'd written for major publications, and a professional website listing his credentials, Ph.D. in philosophy from Columbia, visiting fellow at multiple prestigious universities, founder of a secular humanist organization focused on ethics and social justice. I clicked on an interview from a literary magazine. The accompanying photos showed Julian sitting in what looked like a coffee shop, one hand gesturing mid-explanation, his expression animated. The caption identified the location as Gramercy Park, New York. So far from the Julian I'd known, who had once been passionate about Augustine's Confessions and whose career goal had been teaching theology, who had once believed with the same fervor he now directed toward disbelief. The article quoted him discussing his transformation. My deconversion wasn't primarily intellectual, though reason played its part. It was experiential, realizing that what I'd interpreted as God's presence was actually a complex emotional response conditioned by years of religious immersion. Once I understood the psychology of belief, the cognitive architecture of faith, I couldn't unsee it. And that was both terrifying and freeing. I closed the laptop, a familiar ache spreading through my chest. This Julian, polished, published, publicly secular, was so far removed from the fervent seminarian who had once pressed his forehead to mine and whispered, I think loving you might be the closest I've ever come to understanding divine love. I moved to the small prie-dieu in the corner of my study, kneeling to pray. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, my mind filled with memories I'd spent 7 years trying to suppress. Julian's hand covering mine as we read theological texts together. The way he'd looked at me across the seminary dining hall, the abandoned chapel where we'd first crossed the line from friendship to something forbidden, his confession mingling with mine in the shadows. Help me, I whispered, unsure if I was addressing God or merely the empty room. Help me know what to do. No divine answer came. Only the quiet certainty that I would say yes to the dialogue series, as I suspect both Julian and the bishop knew I would. Because despite everything, my vows, my faith, the life I'd built, some part of me had been waiting 7 years for Julian Reeves to return. I called Bishop Callahan the next morning and accepted the assignment. 3 days later, I found myself in a meeting room at the Interfaith Council, seated across a polished conference table from the man I'd once loved more than anything except God. "Father Bennett," Julian greeted me, extending his hand with a formal smile that revealed nothing. "Thank you for agreeing to this dialogue." "Mr. Reeves," I replied, taking his hand briefly. The contact was impersonal, nothing like the last time we'd touched. His fingers gripping mine desperately as I told him I was choosing the priesthood, choosing a life that couldn't include him. We weren't alone. The council director and 2 university representatives were there to discuss logistics. But I felt Julian's attention like a physical weight as we reviewed the format for the public conversations, opening statements, structured discussion, audience questions. All very civilized, as the bishop had said. All very safe, until the meeting concluded and everyone else filed out, leaving us momentarily alone in that sterile room with its motivational posters about diversity and understanding. "It's good to see you, Thomas," Julian said once the door closed, his voice softening into something more familiar, the formal facade slipping just slightly. "You too," I admitted, because lying seemed worse than acknowledging the simple truth. "You look well." "So do you. The collar suits you." His eyes, still that remarkable shade of amber I remembered, studied me with an intensity that made me acutely aware of my clerical attire. "Are you happy? In your vocation?" The directness was pure Julian. No small talk, no easing into difficult subjects. "I am," I said and meant it. "It's challenging work, but fulfilling. And you? You've clearly found success in your new direction." A shadow of something, hurt, disappointment, crossed his face at my careful phrasing. "If by new direction you mean abandoning the delusion that shaped the first 25 years of my life, then yes, I've found success." He sighed, running a hand through his hair in a gesture so achingly familiar it made my throat tighten. "I'm sorry." That was unnecessarily combative. Old habits. "We always did bring out the debater in each other," I offered, attempting a smile. "Among other things." His gaze held mine for a moment too long before he glanced away. "I should warn you that I'm not planning to pull any punches in these dialogues, Thomas. I respect you too much for that." "I wouldn't expect otherwise." I gathered my notes, needing something to do with my hands. "May I ask why you requested me specifically? There are others in the diocese more versed in apologetic." Julian's expression turned thoughtful. "Because you were always honest, even when it was difficult. Because you never took the easy route in theological discussions." He paused. "And because I think you, of all people, might actually listen to what I have to say rather than simply waiting for your turn to refute it." Before I could respond, he added, "Besides, who better to debate than someone who once knew you intimately?" The word hung between us, laden with everything we weren't saying. "I'll see you Thursday evening, then," I said finally, moving toward the door. "First dialogue, Faith and Reason." "The classic battleground," he replied with a hint of his old smile. "For what it's worth, I'm glad it's you, Thomas." I nodded, not trusting myself to respond, and left before I could say or do something inappropriate. Like ask him if he ever thought about us. Like confess that sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, I still did. Thursday evening arrived with uncomfortable swiftness. The community center auditorium was nearly full, a mix of parishioners, university students, and community members drawn by the prospect of intellectual conflict. Bishop Callahan sat in the front row, offering me an encouraging nod as I took my place at one of 2 tables arranged on the small stage. Julian entered from the opposite side, dressed in a charcoal suit that made him look like the academic he now was. We'd agreed to business casual, and I'd opted for black slacks and a blue button-down with my clerical collar. As we took our seats, I noticed a small silver pin on Julian's lapel, the symbol of his humanist organization, I assumed. The moderator, a local professor of religious studies, introduced us both with appropriate academic gravity before explaining the format. Then it was time to begin. Julian offering the first opening statement as the visiting speaker. "Thank you all for coming," he started, his voice confident and clear. "I want to begin by acknowledging the courage it takes to engage with ideas that challenge our deepest beliefs. Whether you're a person of faith or not, questioning fundamental assumptions is never comfortable." He went on to outline his position with precision and surprising respect. Religion as a human construct designed to provide meaning and order in a chaotic universe. The psychology of belief as an adaptive mechanism. The problem of suffering as an insurmountable challenge to the concept of a loving deity. When my turn came, I found myself speaking not to the audience but directly to Julian, as if we were back in our seminary study group. "Mr. Reeves offers compelling observations about the psychological benefits of religious belief," I began. "Where we differ is in concluding that these benefits indicate religion is merely a human invention rather than a human response to divine reality." As the dialogue progressed, moving from prepared statements to direct engagement, I felt something shift between us. The years seemed to fall away, and we were once again what we had always been best at being, intellectual sparring partners, challenging each other's assumptions, pushing each other toward greater clarity. Faith isn't blind acceptance, I argued at one point. It's trust based on experience, relationship, and yes, reason. The same way I trust that the sun will rise tomorrow based on past evidence, even though I can't prove with absolute certainty that it will. "But there's a crucial difference," Julian countered, leaning forward with the intensity one remembered so well. "Your confidence in the sunrise is based on observable patterns and natural laws. Faith in God requires accepting extraordinary claims with far less evidence. Or perhaps, I suggested, it requires recognizing that different types of knowledge demand different forms of evidence. You can't prove love exists in a laboratory either, yet we all acknowledge its reality based on experience." A flicker of something crossed his face. "An interesting example, Father. But we can observe the neurochemical processes associated with love, the behavioral patterns it produces. It's a natural phenomenon, not a supernatural one." "Is it, though?" I pressed. "Ask anyone who has experienced profound love if it feels merely chemical, merely natural. There are realities that transcend scientific categorization without being any less real." The dialogue continued this way for nearly 2 hours, weaving between abstract philosophical concepts and deeply personal questions about meaning, certainty, and truth. The audience seemed captivated. The expected tension between believer and atheist transformed into something more nuanced, two perspectives in serious, respectful conversation. When the formal portion concluded and we moved to audience questions, someone asked the inevitable, "How do you maintain such respectful dialogue when your worldviews are so fundamentally opposed?" Julian and I exchanged glances, a moment of unspoken communication passing between us. "Father Bennett and I share something important," Julian answered carefully. "We both care more about pursuing truth than protecting our egos. That creates space for genuine dialogue. And," I added, "we recognize that behind intellectual positions are human beings with authentic experiences that deserve respect, even when we interpret those experiences differently." The questioner seemed satisfied, but I noticed Bishop Callahan studying us with thoughtful eyes. After the event concluded, Julian and I found ourselves momentarily alone backstage as the organizers chatted with audience members in the hall. "That was not what I expected," he admitted, loosening his tie slightly. "I'd forgotten how good you are at this, Thomas." "You're not exactly out of practice yourself," I replied with a small smile. "Your arguments have evolved since seminary." "Everything has evolved since seminary." His expression turned more serious. "Would you have dinner with me? Just to talk, before the next dialogue. There are things I'd like to discuss outside the formal setting." Every instinct for self-preservation urged me to refuse. But 7 years of discipline couldn't quite extinguish the pull of his presence. "There's a restaurant on Maple Street, Giovanni's," I said. "Quiet, good food. Tomorrow at 7. He nodded, relief evident in his features. "I'll be there." As I watched him walk away, I wondered if I was making a monumental mistake, or taking the first step towards some kind of closure I hadn't known I needed. Giovanni's was indeed quiet. The following evening, the dimly lit interior and well-spaced tables offering the privacy we both seemed to crave. Julian was already seated when I arrived, having chosen a corner booth far from the other diners. "I took the liberty of ordering wine," he said as I slid into the seat across from him. Then remembered and cancelled it. "Sorry." "It's fine," I assured him. "I can have wine with dinner. Contrary to popular belief, Catholic priests aren't required to abstain completely." A faint smile crossed his lips. The number of Catholic misconceptions I still carry is embarrassing for someone who spent 3 years in seminary. 7 years is a long time, I offered. Things change. Some things. His eyes met mine. Not everything. The waiter's arrival provided a welcome interruption, giving me a moment to collect myself as we ordered. When we were alone again, Julian wasted no time getting to the heart of the matter. "I owe you an apology, Thomas," he said, his fingers fidgeting with the stem of his water glass. "The way things ended between us, what I said to you that last night. It was unfair. I hadn't expected this. In the privacy of my prayers, in the rare moments I allowed myself to remember, I had always cast myself as the one who'd caused harm, choosing my vocation over what we had shared." "You were hurt," I said carefully. "We both were. It was an impossible situation." "Maybe." He took a sip of water, gathering his thoughts. "But telling you that you were using God as an excuse to hide from yourself, from us, that was cruel. And pretty rich coming from someone who would eventually leave the faith entirely." The memory rose unbidden. Julian's face, devastated and angry in the seminary garden where I told him my decision. His accusation that I was choosing safety over authenticity, institution over love. The way he'd walked away without looking back. "Why did you leave?" I asked, a question that had haunted me for years finally finding voice. "Was it because of what happened between us?" He considered this, his expression thoughtful. "Not directly, but I think losing you forced me to examine what I truly believed without the cushion of shared faith that seminary provided. Once I started asking questions without the fear of disappointing you or our professors or the community we'd built, I found I couldn't stop." Our meals arrived, pasta for him and risotto for me, but neither of us did more than pick at the food. "And you?" he asked after a moment. "Did you ever doubt? After?" "Of course," I admitted. "Faith isn't the absence of doubt, Julian. It's the choice to trust despite it." I hesitated, then offered a truth I rarely voiced. There were nights, especially early in my priesthood, when the silence felt absolute. When God seemed entirely absent. But then morning would come, and with it a parishioner who needed counsel, or a child asking questions about heaven, or the simple peace of the morning Mass. And I would remember why I chose this life. "Even knowing what you were giving up?" His voice was gentle, but the question cut deep. "Especially then," I said quietly, "because a vocation isn't about what you're giving up. It's about what you're saying yes to." He studied me for a long moment. "You still believe, don't you? Truly believe, I mean, not just going through the motions." "Yes," I said simply. "I do." Something like resignation passed across his features. "I envy that sometimes. The certainty." "It's not certainty," I corrected. "It's trust. There's a difference." We ate in silence for a few minutes, the weight of our history and divergent paths settling between us. Finally, Julian spoke again, his voice softer than before. "I requested you for these dialogues because I needed to know," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "If you were happy, if you regretted your choice, if any part of you ever wondered—" "Julian," I interrupted gently, "I can't." "I know," he said quickly. "I'm not asking you to. I just—" He sighed, running a hand through his hair in that achingly familiar gesture. "I've built this whole identity around rejecting faith, around rational inquiry and empirical evidence. I've written books and given lectures and founded an organization based on moving beyond religion. And then I see you in that audience, and for a split second, I'm 26 again, and none of the intellectual arguments matter because you're looking at me with those same eyes. The confession hung between us, too honest to dismiss, too painful to fully acknowledge. I remember the night we discussed Pascal's wager, I said finally, changing the subject to safer ground. You argued that believing in God just to hedge your bets was intellectually dishonest. A small smile touched his lips. And you said it wasn't about hedging bets, but opening yourself to possibility. You quoted Kierkegaard at me, I recalled. Faith is the highest passion in a human being. And you countered with Aquinas, he continued, the memory clearly as vivid for him as for me. To one who has faith, no explanation is necessary. To one without faith, no explanation is possible. We were quite the theological power couple, I said, immediately regretting the phrasing. But Julian just laughed, a genuine sound that eased some of the tension. We were unbearable, you mean? I'm sure our classmates were sick of our endless debates. Sister Margaret called us the dialectical duo, I reminded him. Behind our backs, she called us a lot more than that, I suspect, he replied with a wry smile. The conversation shifted to memories of seminary, professors we'd admired, classmates we'd kept track of. For a while, it was almost possible to forget the profound divide that now separated us, almost, but not quite. As we finished our meal, Julian asked, Do you think, in some alternate universe, we found a way to make it work? Where I kept my faith, or you found a different path? The question ached with possibility. I don't know, I answered honestly. I believe God's plan for me included the priesthood, but I also believe He gave us free will, so perhaps in some other possibility. I trailed off, unwilling to complete the thought. I don't believe in God's plan anymore, Julian said quietly, but I do sometimes wonder about the paths not taken. When the check came, he insisted on paying. Consider it penance for all the terrible things I said about organized religion in my book, he joked, though the humor didn't quite reach his eyes. Outside the restaurant, standing in the cool evening air, we faced each other with the awkwardness of people who once knew each other intimately, but now occupied different worlds. The second dialogue is on Tuesday, I said, filling the silence. Morality without religion. Should be less controversial than today's conversation, he replied with a hint of his old sarcasm. I found myself reluctant to say goodbye, to end this brief window where we could speak as Julian and Thomas rather than atheist, author, and Catholic priest. I read your book, I admitted. After the bishop told me you were coming. Surprise flickered across his face. And? It's beautifully written, I said truthfully. Compelling even when I disagreed with your conclusions. I recognized your voice in every page. Thank you, he said, seeming genuinely touched. That means more than you might think. We stood there a moment longer, the space between us charged with everything we couldn't say or do. Finally, Julian took a small step back, creating necessary distance. Good night, Thomas, he said softly. Thank you for dinner. And for listening. Good night, Julian, I replied, watching as he turned and walked toward his hotel, his figure gradually receding into the darkness. I didn't immediately return to the rectory. Instead, I found myself walking towards St. Mary's, the church door unlocked as it always was until night prayers. Inside, the sanctuary was dimly lit, candles flickering at the side altars, the space hushed and reverent. I knelt in my usual pew, the familiar posture of prayer offering some comfort. But instead of the evening office, I found myself speaking directly to God, with the raw honesty I encouraged in my parishioners but too often avoided myself. I still love Him, I whispered into the quiet church. After all this time, after everything that's changed, is that a failure of my vocation? Or is it simply part of the cross I've chosen to bear? No divine voice answered. No burning bush illuminated the path forward. Just the gentle presence I'd come to recognize over years of priesthood, the quiet certainty that I was heard, that my human struggle was understood, that love in all its complex forms was never wasted. I remained there until the sacristan arrived to lock up, my knees stiff from the hard pew, my heart no lighter but perhaps a little more reconciled to its burden. The second dialogue proceeded much like the first, intellectual, respectful, occasionally passionate when we touched on points of deep conviction. Julian argued that moral reasoning could stand independent of religious authority. I countered that while non-believers could certainly be moral people, the foundations of Western ethical thought were inextricably linked to religious traditions. What changed was the current beneath our words, a tacit acknowledgement of our shared history, occasional glances that lingered too long, references to conversations beyond the formal structure of the debate. The audience seemed to sense it too, several questions probing the nature of our prior acquaintance and how it informed our current positions. Father Bennett and I studied together, Julian answered carefully when asked directly. We represent different conclusions drawn from similar starting points. If anything, our history allows for a more nuanced conversation. I nodded in agreement, grateful for his discretion while knowing that anyone watching closely enough might see more than we intended to reveal. Bishop Callahan certainly did. He requested a meeting the day after the second dialogue, his office at the Chancery a study in ecclesiastical dignity. The dialogues are going well, he observed, gesturing for me to take a seat. Better than expected, frankly. There's talk of expanding the series beyond the original 3, perhaps even developing it into a regular feature at the university. I see, I said neutrally, unsure where this was heading. Before we proceed with that possibility, however, he continued, his expression kind but focused, I need to ask you directly, Thomas. What was the nature of your relationship with Mr. Reeves during seminary? The question I'd been dreading for 7 years, finally asked outright. I considered evasion, minimization, technically true but misleading answers. But my vocation demanded honesty, even when difficult. I paused, searching for the right words. We became more than friends. It was brief, inappropriate, and ended when I recommitted to my vocation. The bishop nodded, unsurprised. I suspected as much. Not from anything explicit, he added quickly. But there's a quality to your interaction that suggests history. I'm sorry if it's created a problem, I said, shame and old guilt surfacing. If you'd prefer, I withdraw from the remaining dialogue. That's not what I'm suggesting, he interrupted gently. You've handled yourself with grace and theological precision. I'm more concerned about the personal cost to you. His eyes were compassionate. This can't be easy, Thomas. The kindness in his voice nearly undid me. It's challenging, I admitted, but perhaps necessary for both of us. Closure, he suggested. Something like that. He studied me thoughtfully. The celibate vocation isn't about denying that we can love or have loved. It's about channeling that capacity for love into our broader ministry. He paused. That said, reopening old wounds carries risks. I understand, I assured him. My commitment to my vocation is unchanged. I believe you, he said simply. Just remember that priests need spiritual direction too. My door is always open if you need to talk further. I left his office feeling simultaneously exposed and supported, the weight of secrecy partially lifted after 7 years of careful silence. The final dialogue was scheduled for Friday evening, Finding Meaning in a Material Universe. As the week progressed, Julian and I maintained polite distance, exchanging only necessary emails about format and content. The dinner conversation had shifted something between us, creating an awareness that too much honesty might endanger the careful balance we'd established. Friday arrived with unseasonable warmth, a last breath of autumn before winter's approach. The community center was even more crowded than for previous events, word having spread about the quality of our exchanges. I spotted several clergy from neighboring parishes, university faculty, and what appeared to be a book club that had arrived together, copies of Julian's book in hand. The dialogue itself followed now. Familiar patterns, opening statements, structured discussion, audience engagement. Julian eloquently described how meaning could be constructed rather than discovered, how the finite nature of human existence made experience more precious rather than less meaningful. I countered that while meaning could indeed be found in a purely materialist framework, Persistent human longing for transcendence suggested a reality beyond the material. We inscribe our lives with meaning through our choices, Julian argued during one exchange. Through love, work, art, connection to others. These aren't diminished by being temporary, they're heightened by their very fragility. On that we agree, I responded. Where we differ is whether those meanings point beyond themselves to something eternal. When we love deeply, create beauty, seek justice, are we merely satisfying evolutionary imperatives, or are we responding to echoes of divine reality in our very nature? The dialogue was rich, challenging, occasionally profound. But beneath the intellectual exchange ran a current of something more personal, a conversation within the conversation that only Julian and I could hear. When he spoke of finding meaning in human connection despite its temporary nature, his eyes held mine with unmistakable significance. When I discussed how love could be a window to divine love, I knew he understood I was referencing words he'd once spoken to me. As the event concluded and we thanked the audience for their engagement, I felt a curious mixture of relief and loss. The formal structure that had allowed us to reconnect was ending. Tomorrow, Julian would return to New York to complete his book. I would return to my parish duties, to the life I'd built in his absence. The crowd was slow to disperse, many attendees lingering to ask additional questions or have books signed. I was speaking with a group of my parishioners when I noticed Julian slipping out a side door away from the remaining audience. Without fully intending to, I excused myself and followed. I found him in a small garden behind the community center, sitting on a bench beneath a maple tree already half bare with autumn's progress. He looked up as I approached, not surprised to see me. "Escaping your fans?" I asked, gesturing toward the building. "Something like that." He smiled faintly. "It was a good conversation tonight. All three were." "Yes," I agreed, taking a seat beside him on the bench, careful to maintain appropriate distance. Though I suspect neither of us changed many minds. "That wasn't really the point, was it?" He turned slightly to face me. "We were demonstrating that dialogue is possible across the deepest divides. That respect can coexist with disagreement. A valuable lesson in today's climate," I acknowledged. Silence settled between us, comfortable yet charged with everything still unsaid. Above us, a few golden leaves detached from the maple, spiraling down in a gentle evening breeze. "I'm leaving tomorrow," Julian said finally. "Back to New York to finish the book." "I know." I watched another leaf fall. "Will you include these dialogues?" "I think I have to." His voice softened. "They've shifted my perspective in ways I hadn't anticipated." I looked at him then, really looked at him, the man he'd become, so different from the passionate seminarian I'd known, yet carrying echoes of that younger self in every gesture. "How so?" He seemed to choose his words carefully. "I spent 7 years constructing arguments against faith, positioning religion as the enemy of reason and personal freedom. It was cleaner that way, easier to maintain intellectual distance." "And now," I prompted when he paused, "now I'm sitting next to a brilliant, thoughtful man of faith who has forced me to remember that belief isn't simply a cognitive error or a psychological crutch." His eyes met mine, painfully honest. "It's harder to dismiss religion as inherently harmful when confronted with how it shapes someone like you, someone whose integrity and compassion I can't question even when I disagree with his premises." The admission clearly cost him something. I reached out instinctively, my hand briefly covering his where it rested on the bench between us. "Thank you for that." He looked down at our hands, then back to my face. "I have a confession, Thomas." "I'm listening," I said softly, withdrawing my touch. "I requested these dialogues with an ulterior motive." He took a deep breath. "Not just professional interest or even personal closure. I wanted to prove something to myself, that I could see you again and feel nothing. That what we had was just youthful intensity magnified by the hothouse environment of seminary. My heart beat faster despite my efforts at composure. And what did you discover?" "That I was wrong." His smile was sad, resigned. You stand before me in your collar, quoting Scripture and Thomas Aquinas, embodying everything my rational mind has rejected, and still all I can think about is how your eyes haven't changed at all. The confession hung between us, impossible and true. Julian, I began, not knowing what would follow his name. It's okay, he interrupted gently. I'm not asking for anything. I just needed to say it once before I leave, for my own peace of mind. I looked away, toward the darkening garden, struggling to find the right response. Finally, I spoke from the heart rather than from careful consideration. You recite Scripture, but I only remember your eyes, I said softly, echoing the phrase he'd once written in the margins of my study notes a lifetime ago. That's what you wrote to me, the night before our systematic theology final. Surprise and recognition flashed across his face. You remembered. I remember everything, I admitted. That's part of the sacrifice. Not just future possibilities, but past realities. Carrying them without being able to act on them. He nodded slowly, understanding in his expression. Your vocation isn't just what you do, it's who you are. Yes, I said simply. We sat in silence as twilight deepened around us, the moments stretching between past and present, between what was and what could never be. Finally, Julian stood, brushing invisible dust from his pants in a gesture that seemed more about composure than cleanliness. I should finish packing, he said. Early train tomorrow. I rose as well, maintaining the careful distance we both knew was necessary. Will you let me know when the book is published? The revised version, with our dialogues? Of course. He hesitated, then added, maybe we could do this again sometime. The dialogue series, I mean. There are certainly more topics to explore. I'd like that, I said, meaning it despite knowing it would reopen wounds barely healed. He extended his hand formally, a callback to our first meeting after 7 years. Goodbye, Father Bennett. I took his hand, the touch brief but resonant with shared history. Goodbye, Mr. Reeves. We walked back to the community center together, close but not touching, united by understanding yet separated by the paths we'd chosen. At the door he turned right toward his hotel while I turned left toward St. Mary's, our directions as symbolically opposed as our worldviews. I didn't look back, though every step required conscious effort. My vocation had taught me about necessary separations, about the difference between loving and possessing, about finding meaning in sacrifice rather than fulfillment. Later that night, kneeling in the rectory's small chapel for night prayer, I didn't ask for freedom from feelings that persisted despite time and distance. Instead, I prayed for the grace to transform that love into something that could coexist with my vocation rather than threaten it. To find purpose in the particular cross I had been given to bear. No burning bush appeared. No voice from a whirlwind offered divine clarity. Just the quiet certainty that love, in all its complex forms, was never wasted. That the capacity to connect deeply with another soul, even when that connection couldn't be fully realized, was itself a reflection of divine love rather than a distraction from it. 6 months later, a package arrived at the rectory. Inside was Julian's revised book, now titled Losing Faith, Finding Clarity, Conversations Across the Divide. A note was tucked inside the cover, handwritten in a distinctive script I still remembered from marginalia in shared textbooks. Thomas, our dialogues form the new final chapter. I can't say you changed my mind about God, but you reminded me that faith can coexist with intellectual integrity and genuine compassion. For that perspective shift alone, I'm grateful our paths crossed again. With continuing respect and affection. Julian. P.S. The university has invited us to resume the dialogue series this fall. If you're willing, different topics, same format. I've enclosed the details. I understand completely if you decline. I set the letter down, turning to the book's final chapter titled Conversations with a Believer. The opening paragraph read, Faith and doubt are often positioned as opposites, But my recent dialogues with a thoughtful priest, someone whose intellect and integrity I deeply respect, have reminded me that the most meaningful questions exist not in absolute certainty, but in the honest engagement with uncertainty. While we ultimately reached different conclusions about the nature of reality, our conversations demonstrated something perhaps more valuable than agreement, that understanding across difference is not only possible but essential. I closed the book, a complicated mixture of emotions rising within me. Then I reached for my phone and composed a brief email accepting the invitation for the fall dialogue series. Some connections, I was learning, could be maintained without being fully realized. Some loves could be transformed rather than abandoned. And sometimes the divine revealed itself not despite our human attachments, but through them, reminding us that love, in all its imperfect, complicated forms, remains the surest bridge between souls, whether or not we agree on where that bridge ultimately leads.